Good morning and welcome to this week's Wednesday's reflection. This week I chose to stick with Paul's letter to the Corinthian church and an interesting passage this week that poses the question, what motivates us to proclaim the good news? And what shapes our proclamation? For Paul, it seems that the motivating force of what he has come to announce comes from a profound sense of call. For Paul, God's call to him is shaped by a pair of powerful and interlaced forces. The God who called him and the people who would hear the good news that he has come to share. It seems to me that for Paul, God and the people to whom God has sent him are tied together. These verses that I will share with you shortly are in the middle of Paul's larger argument about the nature of Christian community. The Corinthians have found themselves torn apart by a number of internal forces which are threatening to sever their bonds. So Paul writes to them to remain one, to continue being bound together as a sign of their faith. Some of this came up last week in the reading that we heard. This was when Paul addresses their question about whether Christians should consume meat that was sacrificed to idols. The Corinthian community had experienced division on this question. Some had expressed their opinion that the consumption of such meat was indifferent, while others say it is potentially destructive concession to pagan practice. Paul, however, had argued that idols are nothing, and so meat sacrificed to them is nothing. But this was a wisdom that was held by the strong in their faith, and the weak had not come to understand this yet. Paul suggested that it was more important to support the ones who were weaker in their faith by nurturing them. In what way they would preserve their community that way. Paul does this by attempting to integrate himself into whomever he was speaking. And by doing so, I am sure that there were some who didn't take this way too well. Some may have felt that he was even lacking integrity because it seemed that he lacked a spine or a definitive position on most issues. So let me share these verses with you from 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 16 to 33. And I'm sharing this with you from the Message. I really like the way this version puts this. Still, I want to make it clear that I have never gotten anything out of this for myself and that I'm not writing now to get anything. I'd rather die than give anyone ammunition to discredit me or question my motives. If I proclaim the message, it's not to get something out of it for myself. I'm compelled to do it, and doomed if I don't. If this was my own idea of just another way to make a living, I'd expect some pay. But since it's not my idea, but something solemnly entrusted to me, why would I expect to get paid? So I am getting anything out of it? Yes, as a matter of fact, the pleasure of proclaiming the message at no cost to you. You don't even have to pay my expenses. Even though I am free of all demands and expectations of everyone, I have voluntarily become a servant to any and all in order to reach a wide range of people. Religious, non-religious, meticulous moralists, loose living immoralists, the defeated, the demoralized, whoever. I didn't take on their way of life. I kept my bearings on Christ, but I entered their world and tried to experience things from their point of view. I've become just about every sort of servant there is in my attempts to lead those I met into a God-saved life. I did all this because of the message. I didn't just want to talk about it. I wanted to be in it, on it too. Here ends our reading. Yet here, Paul seems to leave himself open to such dark conclusions about his character by saying over and over that he blends right in with whatever group of people he is among at any given moment. I just love that. The meticulous moralists, he becomes one of them. The loose living moralists, and he becomes one of them, the defeated and the demoralized, and he becomes one of them. Paul adapts and speaks to them accordingly. Is he with people who object to things that are not really objectable, and they just object anyway because they are less mature in their faith? Paul plays along, and on he goes. So we wonder what is going on here. How can we interpret these words in a way that we don't cast Paul into a bad light? I think for me, becoming all things to all people does not require losing oneself. Instead, Paul is trying to describe a radical way of life in which he walks alongside all kinds of people in order to draw them to God. The weak don't understand, yet that idols are powerless, and that meat sacrificed to them ought not to affect their behavior. But Paul doesn't push this on them and try and force them to understand. Instead, Paul walks with them. Paul wrote in order to respond to particular moments in the lives of these early churches. While it is often difficult to reconstruct their situations since we only have one side of the correspondence, but in each case, I believe that Paul addresses those in the Corinth community as a means to preserve their unity, and above all else, to connect the gospel of Christ to a particular way of life in the community of faith. No community of faith will ever match us with a group of people just like us. But in the midst of that difference, God is moving with us. Paul is not calling the Christians at Corinth to witness that is insincere, one filled with an offensive style of remaking themselves into something they are not. Instead, Paul is seeking an inner transformation. The motivation for becoming all things to all people is not a draw to attention to our own faith. Instead, we are motivated by the possibility of an authentic relationship. Our faith tells us that God's love can be shared in any place and circumstance. Jesus met people in the places where they lived and worked. Paul is asking the Corinthians and us to do and risk the same. I believe Heritage United Church has always done their best at this. And I hope for those of you listening to this reflection who have joined us here at Heritage, some of you maybe never in person before, that you would agree that our mission as Christians is to be the hands and feet of Christ. And so we direct our hands and our feet to the needs of our community and the world around us. And through our heart, we are moved into action. In this past year, I've seen actions directed in the most creative ways. Zoom calls, email updates, online services, phone call happy birthday greetings, care packages delivered, and so much more. We've gone into places that are unfamiliar, places outside of our sphere of experience, and by doing so, we have been given the opportunity to be transformed, and we share journeys of hope and faith with others. As we continue down this road in 2021, each one of us will have to find the people and the places that inspire our hearts. When we do, our hands and feet will not be held back. We will know that we are doing Christ's work in the world, and our faith will be transformed from the inside out. All of us, this has reminded me of a bulletin we used I looked back in 2015. I went and dug it out of our binders. We keep thinking, why do we save all these things? Well, I'll tell you why. For days like this, a heart made of snow. Isn't that great? I just love that bulletin. It was a bulletin used in February of 2015. A heart made from a substance that can be molded and shaped into something new. A heart that eventually will melt and become part of its surroundings. A heart being held by hands that are a rainbow of color. a reflection of God's heart and God's embrace. It may have been just snow, cold and unnaturally shaped, but if we look at it this way, we see how we too can be molded and shaped as the hands and feet of Christ and journey along, just like those of the Corinthian church so long ago. And so may we be molded and guided in our journey forward this week. Have a great week. God bless.